The Lady Be Good. In the spring of 1943, amidst the devastation of World War II, the British airfield bustled with anxious energy. A young American woman, Evelyn Harper, dressed in an unassuming coat and sturdy boots, hurried through the throng. Known as Eve to her friends, she was a skilled mechanic and one of the few women stationed at the base. What most didn't know was that she had also earned a reputation as a brilliant, daring pilot, a rare talent that drew both admiration and jealousy in the predominantly male-dominated field. On this particular day, Eve's heart raced as she approached a new aircraft, a B-24 Liberator bomber, recently christened the Lady Be Good by the crew who would be taking her on their first long-range mission. Eve had spent hours working with the ground crew to prepare the plane, which had already become a source of pride for her. Her nickname around the base, the Lady, had somehow fused with the plane itself, making the Lady Be Good more than just a machine to her. As dusk settled, Captain Tom Hughes, a hard-edged but fair commander, approached Eve. "Are you sure she's ready?" he asked, nodding toward the plane. "She's ready," Captain Eve replied, her voice steady. "She'll take you as far as you need to go and bring you home. Just take care of her." The captain, well aware of Eve's bond with the bomber, gave her a reassuring nod, but Eve couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss. That evening, as the crew of the Lady Be Good took to the skies for a mission over North Africa, Eve stayed at the base, watching the horizon long after the plane had disappeared. Hours turned into days, and no word arrived from the crew. When the bomber failed to return, it was officially declared missing. Grief-stricken and restless, Eve refused to accept the loss. She convinced Captain Hughes to organize a reconnaissance mission to search for the Lady Be Good and her crew. They could still be out there. They have to be, she insisted. After days of relentless searching, the crew discovered wreckage in the desolate expanse of the Libyan desert. The plane had crash-landed, and though the Lady Be Good was damaged, the name emblazoned on her side was still visible. Nearby, they found signs that the crew had tried to survive but ultimately had to leave the wreckage in search of help. Eve stood by the battered bomber, placing a hand on its weathered fuselage. In that quiet moment, she whispered, "You brought them this far." She felt a pang of sorrow, but also a surge of pride. Her lady had done everything she could, even if it hadn't been enough. Back at the base, the Lady Be Good became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. Though the crew was lost, Eve found comfort in knowing that the bomber she'd helped prepare had fought alongside them until the end. She continued her work with renewed purpose, keeping alive the memory of the Lady Be Good and the crew who had become her family in the skies. The Lady Be Good. The mechanic and the machine. The airfield hummed with controlled chaos. It was early April in 1943, and every person, plane, and piece of equipment was a cog in the relentless machinery of the Allied effort against Axis forces. Evelyn Harper, a young American mechanic, stood amidst this cacophony of engines, shouting voices, and exhaust fumes. At 22, Eve was a natural with machinery, known across the airfield for her meticulous attention to detail. But she had more than just a knack for mechanics. She had a gift for understanding the planes in a way that felt almost personal. After several grueling months, a new B-24 Liberator bomber had arrived at the base, pristine and untarnished by the war raging around it. The ground crew had just finished christening it the Lady Be Good. Eve looked up at the gleaming white letters painted on the fuselage, feeling a surge of pride. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, she felt a deep connection to this aircraft. It wasn't just a machine, it was something she believed in. Her best friend, Harry Collins, a fellow mechanic, nudged her. "They're calling her the Lady Be Good, just like you," he teased, his smile warm. Eve rolled her eyes but smiled. "She's got more class than I ever will, Harry." To her surprise, Captain Tom Hughes, a seasoned and battle-hardened pilot with a quiet, steely demeanor, was assigned to command the bomber's first mission. Despite his rough exterior, Captain Hughes had a reputation for taking care of his crew and his planes. Eve respected him immensely, but she never could shake the feeling that there was a sadness behind his eyes, something heavy he carried with him. On the eve of the mission, Captain Hughes approached Eve with a question that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're sure she's ready?" "Captain," she replied, meeting his eyes, I've spent every waking hour making sure she is. The lady will carry you far and bring you back." Her voice wavered only slightly. He gave her a curt nod, then, with a hint of gentleness, said, "Take care, Miss Harper." As dusk settled that night, the Lady Be Good taxied down the runway with her crew of 9 on board. Eve stood by the airstrip, watching the bomber as it rose, a sleek shadow against the darkening sky, and then it was gone. She held her breath, feeling a pang of foreboding that she couldn't shake, even as the hours stretched into the empty silence of night. The waiting game. The airfield felt hollow the following morning. News had come in an attack had been launched over North Africa, but the Lady Be Good and her crew were nowhere to be found. Days passed with no word, and the sinking realization dawned upon everyone on base the bomber was missing in action. The official report listed the B-24 as lost over the Libyan desert, along with all hands on board. For Eve, the news hit like a physical blow. She became a shadow of herself, haunted by memories of Captain Hughes's gaze and her own promise that the Lady Be Good would bring him back. Every night, she returned to the hangar and sat alone, staring at the empty space where the bomber once stood. But as the days dragged into weeks, something shifted within her. She couldn't simply let go, not without knowing what had happened. She was no stranger to loss. Her own brother had been killed in action in the early days of the war, but this was different. She felt a fierce responsibility for the fate of that crew and their bomber. The plane she'd poured her heart into was out there somewhere, waiting for her to find it. Eve took her determination to the commanding officer, proposing an unofficial search mission. After much convincing, Captain Hughes agreed, deeply moved by her conviction. He arranged for a reconnaissance crew to search the desert, and they set out, fueled by Eve's refusal to let go of hope. Into the desert. The desert was a vast, unending expanse, an unforgiving landscape of golden dunes stretching as far as the eye could see. Days of searching led to nothing but endless sand, and Eve's hope began to waver. But on the 4th day, their radio crackled with news. A wreckage had been spotted, a downed B-24. The coordinates pointed them deeper into the Libyan desert, and as the reconnaissance team approached, they saw the glint of metal against the sand. There she was, the Lady Be Good, sitting half buried in sand like a ghostly monument in the desolate landscape. The bomber's nose was bent from the impact, her wings fractured, but the name on her side was still clear as day, shining like a beacon in the desert sun. Eve felt her heart clench as they examined the wreck. There were signs that the crew had survived the crash, at least initially. Canteens, empty ration packets, and makeshift shelters littered the sand nearby. They must have stayed with the plane for days before deciding to venture out in search of water and help. But in the blistering heat of the desert, survival was a near impossibility. The search team spread out, and miles away from the bomber, they found the first set of remains, then another. The crew had scattered in different directions, each one clinging to a fading hope of reaching safety. The reality of their final hours wandering in a desperate attempt to survive hit Eve like a hammer blow. She stood amidst the sand, alone in her grief, feeling the weight of each step they must have taken. The lady lives on. Back at the airfield, the Lady Be Good became a symbol of sacrifice and courage. Though her crew had perished, their bravery and resilience in the face of the impossible were remembered. Every person on base now knew the story of the lady and her crew, and they paid their respects in silence. Eve took it upon herself to keep their memory alive. Each night, she sat in the hangar, recounting stories of Captain Hughes and the men of the Lady Be Good to anyone willing to listen. She'd crafted a small plaque that read, "To those who face the endless sky and beyond." It hung in the hangar beside the crew's photos and the flag they'd left behind. Eve's sorrow eventually softened, replaced by a sense of purpose. She became a mentor to the younger mechanics and pilots, sharing her knowledge with a fiery passion. Her legend grew, and she became known not just as a mechanic but as the heart and soul of the base. Every time a new bomber took off, she whispered a silent prayer, believing that the lady was watching over them. The war would end and the years would pass, but Evelyn Harper never forgot. She stayed at that airfield long after the fighting stopped, a quiet guardian of the past. And each spring, when the sun set over the horizon, she'd look up, remembering a time when the Lady Be Good soared through the skies, carrying with her the hearts and hopes of a crew who dared to dream, even in the face of the impossible. The Forgotten Guardian. Decades later, historians uncovered the story of the Lady Be Good and the sacrifice her crew had made in the Libyan desert. Artifacts were recovered, personal stories resurfaced, and the plane was eventually returned to its homeland, where it became a memorial. But Evelyn Harper's name remained tied to that of the bomber, remembered as a woman who had refused to let go of hope, and as the one who'd seen the spirit of the lady and her crew home at last.